Hey everyone, welcome back to Christian Talks Product Design. I'm your host, Christian Pineda, and this is the podcast where I sit down with fellow designers to learn about how they are navigating their design careers. Thanks to each and every single one of you who tune in each episode so that we can all continue to grow and learn together. If you're new here, I want to extend a big welcome. I hope you find today's conversation inspiring and thought provoking. If you haven't already, subscribe to the Substack. That's where I'm constantly sharing new podcast episodes, newsletters, and resources. Today, I'm joined by Frankie Kastenbaum. Not only is she an amazing UX UI designer, having worked with companies like Adobe and HP, just to mention a few, but she's also an advocate for UX designers by constantly sharing resources and guidance for those that are trying to break into the industry. With that, I won't spoil too much of today's episode. Let's dive into it. I am super excited to get to know you, Frankie. Before diving in, I'd love to get a quick who are you and what are you all about?
Totally. But first off, thank you for having me today. I'm super excited to be here and just get to chatting and have more of a conversation with you. So, super excited to get into it. But yeah, I can totally give you some context about who I am and kind of how I got here, I guess. So, I'm currently a senior UX designer and a content creator, but I guess we can go back to the beginning and really understand how I got here and a little bit more about who I am. So, I like to start with high school days, which I promise will come all together. It makes a lot more sense when you hear it all together. But I like to say that in high school, I was really into solving problems, being creative, using a lot of like design mediums, as well as also learning to code, and really using those different ways to mess around and kind of create projects. Thought I'd be an engineer, actually. Fun fact. But
No
that did not
way.
happen. Yes.
Just to make sure your journey started all the way back in high school. That I'm really amazed by that. You already had this idea of like I love technology or I like technology and you pursued that, right? How far did you get into engineering?
Um, so learned front end and back in a couple of different languages, like in like summer programs, just because I was really intrigued by it. And then freshman year, first semester, I lasted that's about it. After first semester of college, I was like, this ain't for me. As much as I loved a lot of the pieces, it was not gonna happen. It was my brain did not work that way.
Was there a defining moment for you where you kind of just like had to take a step back and say, you know what? I like the idea of coding. I sometimes enjoy just tinkering around with it, but I'm much more drawn to something else. And what caused that?
Yeah, there was definitely a big kind of pivot moment for me. So during that first semester of college, I started to realize I was spending all my time at office hours, even though keep in mind, like I had learned a bit of that language previously. And as much as I was there for school and I still am a huge person who loves, to focus on my work, and that's a huge part of who I am and what I love to do. But I started to realize like I can't just be in office hours 24/7. There's more to college than just being in office hours. So I wanted to be able to actually enjoy it as well. That I realized, okay, like let's take a step back here and figure out what it is that I actually like to try and figure out like is there something I can do that's a little more, I guess, a little more of a balance between the fun and the school. And so that was really that kind of moment of okay, let's take a step back because this is too hard. My brain is not mathematical. Do not ask me any mathematical questions. It will
Yeah.
not end well.
And I think my experience with coding has been generally similar. In that at first I really thought that I was going to go into engineering, and then I ended up really enjoying the design side of things. But for me, what frustrated me the most about engineering was even when you understand the concept, a bulk of the time is focused on bugs,
Oh,
right?
100%. I
And
used to, oh, go for it.
no, I was just gonna say, and you could be there for hours on end trying to figure out like what's going on, and it'll be a comma on line like 1002. For me, it was insanely frustrating. Did you have a similar experience to
Oh,
that?
100%. It was beyond frustrating where I did like the kind of the balance that it was like a right or a wrong in some extent, but exactly to your point, it was beyond frustrating when it was like one silly little thing, like a space or this or that. But I think it's funny. This was when like stickers on laptops were like really, really big. I feel like it's kind of died down a
Yeah.
bit. But I used to have a sticker that said, "My code works," and I don't know why. And it was extremely accurate because that was always the case.
I would definitely purchase one of, like, if it was in a mug, that would be on my desk. Which actually reminds me, I learned that you actually have a pretty entrepreneurial side,
I do.
right? It seems like from a long time now, you've loved pursuing ideas and, seeing if they would work or not. And one of the early ones was Frankie's teas.
Hmm.
Could you tell me about that? Like, to me, when I saw that, I thought that was so cool. Not just because of, the courage that you had and, trying to pursue that. A lot of people don't. But also in how much people learn when they try to launch their own thing, right? Reflecting back on it, how did you come up with the idea? How did you, go about executing it? And, what are your thoughts on what it taught you now?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Actually, I'll kind of say a little crazier fact. That was kind of the second stint that I had had. There was
Right.
actually one before that that was very, very small that didn't last very long. That I basically was drawing on sneakers as like tailgate shoes. Whereas
Cool.
basically people that were getting into college, it was like a little gift that you would have like the mascots and things like that, like on the actual shoe. So that was kind of the first intro to it, actually. And then because I was in graphic design classes at this point, I realized that like I actually wanted to do something with it because I'd always had this idea of wanting a business, trying to figure out kind of how to do something more with it, I guess, and not just make it like a school project. And so I ultimately actually had Frank Tees, which was like a tailgating apparel company, which started out as t-shirts. Then it turned into, I actually, for Mardi Gras, which is my most fun one, made a pair of leggings, which I love to wear during Mardi Gras one year, which was a lot of fun, that I had fully hand drawn everything. But yeah, that was kind of one of the first, I guess the two first main places I kind of started with that side of it. Takeaways that you asked about, I think it was more of one of the biggest things is like just don't be afraid to try it out, which I think you were alluding to a little bit is like I'm sure we all have ideas and I think most times like we don't follow through with them. There's so many people now saying is like that first step is the hardest. And it's just like take that first day and like see what happens and just kind of explore. And I think that that was one of the biggest takeaways is like, okay, like I can do this. And like I'm grateful, like actually my parents kind of pushed me into it. That they were like, yeah, run with it, go for it. That they weren't just like, what are you doing? Like you're in college. Um, but yeah, I think that was one of the bigger takeaways is just like try it out. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But like, why not? You may as well see what happens. And like, I think I also learned a lot of the business side of it because I was a full one man show. I was designing, I was think dealing with figuring out how to actually get the physical apparel too. So like I partnered with a company to make a deal with them to figure out like what was the best way of doing this. Like, did I do individual? Did I do a bulk order? And then figuring out how to market and sell it myself. So it was doing all of it and just learning on the fly. So a lot of learnings.
That's really cool. So, was that kind of your intro to design, given that you were pursuing engineering, or was
Not
that kind
exactly.
of like a layer on top of something else?
I guess it just always goes back to being a kid and like being younger and just kind of like seeing now, like, oh, it all like connects the dots. And I didn't think through it, like really what I was doing then. But
Yeah.
when I was younger, I made a lot of like graphics or videos for like friends and family and just like silly little things around the house type thing. And I think that was really my intro into design, which pretty different to what I do now. It was definitely a lot more like video, I would say, which
Mhm.
these days is not really my focus. But I think that was kind of it all was the connection together of like the business, the engineering, the design was like realizing it was the creative and the problem solving piece, I think is what it came down to.
I love hearing that. It really does come down to that, right? I think in excelling in a field like this, you really do have to, fall in love with the idea of like what problems are there? How can I creatively solve them? And when you start your own thing, what a lot of people don't know is even if it's a small scale project, in the future, I feel like it does help a lot. in communicating with other stakeholders if you end up going into either an agency or a corporate landscape? I don't know. Do you have thoughts about that?
100%. I think that I know I'm from the mentality, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm yet to be proven that way yet. I'm convinced that like any past skill sets of any sort, whether it's from the business or not, or engineering, like I'm talking pick a random skill or a random role, and like I think it connects to. I think there's always skills that are interconnected to kind of the design entrepreneurial. I'm not going to even say that word, but into this whole space. I think there's so many overlaps between all different industries that I think that kind of whatever you can pull from, do it.
Mhm.
I think that's where it comes down to, like, as cheesy as it is like the importance of just starting and trying.
100%. I think, it's always the first step that's the hardest. And then once you're in the rhythm, everything just kind of falls into place and you figure out the path from there. And on that note, I guess I'm curious to know, you eventually made your way into General Assembly. What made you decide that, you know what, a boot camp is the right choice for you? And also, reflecting on it, do you think that a boot camp is still a good path for a lot of designers that might be, you know, considering a career switch or really just want to get into the field really early and fast? It's a loaded question.
It's
So,
a very loaded question, so I started laughing, but yeah, no, it's a great question, as loaded as it is. But yeah, I there was 2 parts to this question. So the first one was about General Assembly and what got me there. We'll start with that piece. So for me in college, so if we kind of go back to the story, I said I got to a point where I realized that pivotal moment where engineering was not for me. So I started exploring and trying to figure out like what was the golden thread and what I wanted to do. And I ended up in the design space. And I think that I was actually lucky that at that time, my senior year of college was when UX was becoming more and more of a thing. And so I actually took 2 classes that semester, one on UX and one on UI. And so I left college very high level, but having a rough idea of what this industry was, which I think at that time was kind of unique because it had been around for forever, but in terms of like the name of it and what it is now was up and coming. And so I left college right away knowing that's what I wanted. Because if we go back to the full circle, for me, it was the connection between all the things I had done. It was the connection between the design, the love for design. It was the connection between the engineering side of me and creating and like using something to solve a problem. And so for me, it was a no brainer. It was like, okay, this is literally connecting all my dots. And so I went to GA because I felt like 2 classes was not enough. And so ultimately just did that and never turned back. It was a great decision to go into the space. But then in terms of your other question, because yes, this is a huge one.
yeah.
So, okay, let's actually get into this. So, obviously, as a bootcamp grad myself, I think boot camps are important. I think they are a great piece of learning the puzzle and getting started. But I think they are just that. And that's where I think the loaded bit comes in. I think that boot camps are a starting point to your toolbox. They're going to give you an idea of the industry and some abilities to start understanding like some of the processes to go in. But at the same time, I think that there's 2 pieces at play. One, that they're not going to be the be all end all. You're not going to finish any of these boot camps, no matter which one you pick, and end up being the next famous designer, working for the next big tech company, insert name. No offense, that's just not going to happen for anyone. Realistically, for hardly anyone. I'm not going to say never say never, never say no. But
The odds
I
are much harder. You need to have, a repository of life events.
100%, you really have to, you know, to get to be in that position right after the boot camp, good luck. That's all I'll say. You know, if you do it, great, but that's unlikely. But my point being is I still think that they're a really good starting point. I think they really are helpful, but I think it's all about the mindset and the mentality you go into them with, because that's what's going to set the make or break apart and like set you apart from others about how you kind of end up at the end. So I still tell people, I still tell mentees to go to them. I still think, there's different ones depending on what you want and in terms of like how you learn, but I still think they're good.
Okay. Okay.
What's your take?
I It's tough because I'm from the background where I did a lot of graphic design work before going into a boot camp. And even going all the way back to high school, I was like the art kid, taking visual. I went to a vocational school, so it was very much like graphic design was my thing. I was top of the class. And then when I graduated, I just started freelancing. So it was like, oh, I'm going to go to my barber shop. I'm going to go to the sandwich shop. Hey, do you guys need posters? And that eventually turned into me being scared of going into a artsy field because I thought I was like, I don't want to be a starving artist. I don't know. It was just, part of my like psyche at then. But I kept using those skills to help me with like marketing content when I started working in like the real estate sector, or whenever I would come up with an idea to like launch my own business, whether it was like a photography agency, a videography agency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that to say is I never went through a traditional route of, going to college. I just went to a UX UI boot camp, and like all of those like learned skills that I had from the years before that really paid off at that point. And I completely agree with you. I think it really is a starting point. Like you should not be going into a boot camp and thinking, I'm going to leave this shop and then I'm going to go work for Google or, you know,
Mhm.
Spotify, whatever, and be like their top honcho designer. It's everything is layered. You will get an understanding, I think, of the key processes. What is design thinking? What are some of the tools that you can use at each point? And after you go into some organizations, you're going to figure out when and where those things work. But going back to it, I think a lot of designers do think that they're going to get into the boot camp and then everything's going to be super easy afterward. What was your experience like after you finished the boot camp and you were out job hunting?
So it was a unique time for me because in the middle of my job hunt, COVID hit. So it was a really interesting time where basically I'm in the process of trying to get a job, go through, the format of looking on LinkedIn and different places, and we can get more into that after. But it was kind of this weird thing where I'm in the middle of doing interviews and going through this process, and then the world shuts down, and no one knows what's going on at this point. This is literally as it's okay, we're shutting down for like 2 days. And then obviously we all know what happened after that.
Oh, yeah.
But so it was definitely a unique time to be like, okay, so like, everyone talks about ghosting, and like I have to say, like, there's still companies I'm waiting to hear back from just because like literally the whole world shut down. But jokes aside, it was an interesting time, whether it was COVID or even after that, just trying to figure out kind of what I wanted and what I was looking for. And I actually ended up working for a startup right afterwards. During my boot camp, there was a client that I was working with, and I actually ended up working with them right after. So again, kind of had that unique time of getting the job, just because it was a little different than like going down like the job board perspective. But after that, I think that's the more interesting kind of job search to discuss, because that was more traditional and more kind of pieces that can be taken from a or some advice that can be used for all of you listening. So at that point, I was in a bunch of Slack groups, which highly recommend. I still would do this if I was you, where I basically saw a job posting in one of the groups. To be honest, I don't remember which Slack it was. Um, but I saw a posting for Adobe, and I was like, okay, like this is intriguing. And ultimately actually saw that they wanted about 3 years of experience. I vividly remember all this. And at this point, I was about 1 year into my career. A little bit of freelancing, a little bit of like actual jobs, but it was a mix of all. Definitely, years wise, I did not have it. But I was like, you know what? I got no harm. Let's apply. Ultimately got the role. So it's just kind of, I say this as like a good piece of like a little story, because I think it's, it shows a lot that you never really know. And I think it's that piece of like, just don't be afraid again. Like, I think that's going to be our theme today. But it's true. It's just like, I took the leap of faith because it's like, this sounds interesting. It's a company I've always admired. Like, let's try. And ultimately I worked there. So if I was like, the biggest thing there is like Slack groups, like kind of unique ways of networking. Mouthful.
Are there any Slack groups that come to mind that you would say like, hey, designers should keep this in your back pockets? I don't know if you're familiar with it. Early on, I think it was UX Rescue. That one was really good in terms of just like connecting with other folks that were trying to figure out at least an entry level position in like some volunteering context. I thought that one was really. You're familiar with it?
I didn't know was a Slack group for it, but I knew of it as like a place where you could work with nonprofits and you can be connected to other designers and like work on projects. Never did that one, but I did know of it. That one and like Democracy Lab was another one that I knew of, which were great. I'm trying to look at my Slack to see what I was part of. I remember using Designer Hangout a lot, which I don't know how active it still is.
Designer Hangout. Did
That
you
one was a big one.
ever join, like, I think it's Design Buddies? I know that one's
Mm.
really, really big. I personally never really dove too deeply into that one specifically, but I know it's really big.
Yeah, I never got into that one, but I know a lot about it, and it seems like a great program, like a great group.
Yeah.
But I think that one's actually more on Discord now. Side note. But I'm trying to see. It's been a while, so a lot of them I think are deactivated now. But there is, let me find the link. There's actually this really good resource. It's called designerslack.community. And it has like pages and pages worth of groups.
Designerslack.community.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
I remember spending a lot of time on this and just like joining a number of like random ones.
That's a good. So in that process, were you reaching out to, individuals in those groups, or were you just mostly looking at like their private, job listings?
It was a mix of both. I think it was really dependent, if I remember correctly, it was dependent on the groups itself in terms of like what I was doing and like seeing like which ones were more active and whatnot. But I think if I was to do it over, like looking at it now, I definitely would have been more active in those groups rather than just being like somewhat of a ghost and just looking at the jobs because you never know who's going to know who. So I think that would have been like what I wish I had done type moment.
It all goes back to, having the courage to take that first step, introduce yourselves. And if you are in a position where you're job hunting, those are great spaces, to poke around.
There's actually a great one in New York. I should mention them. As a fellow New Yorker, as a New Yorker myself, there's a great one. I know there's two of us here. There's one called the UX Support Group, which I'm a little biased. My book club is hosted by them, and like on their platform. But it's honestly a really good supportive group, both in person and virtually. And so that is, I would recommend, even if you're not in New York. I think that's actually a good one. That would have been one I would have joined earlier.
Well, we're going to make sure that that is in the show notes for anybody that's listening. Great resources there. And Frankie, I have to say, like, one of the things that I do admire about you is the fact that, you take that first step. Now, back in 2020, the job market, all the way back to like 2022, the job market was so different than what it is now. Now, I'm always a proponent of saying if you see a job listing, regardless of how many years of experience it says, just apply. And I know some designers don't agree with that. I'm personally always of the mindset that you never know what they're going to say. Sometimes they're just reading people out. But what I did want to ask you, how different do you actually, I guess a better question, something that I did want to ask you is a lot of people don't really get that there are two different aspects to the way that you can run your design career. And what I mean by that is there is this whole field of agency designers. And they need to have a very clear mindset on what that is. Is that the right choice for me? Versus a designer that might be going the corporate route where you're joining a company and that's the single project that you're working on. There might be different features and experiences, but it's all part of one company. Do you have any thoughts on, just kind of sharing with designers what that all means and how they can best position themselves to go one or the other route?
Can I answer the first question first? Because I like that.
Yeah, of course. I know I'm going to keep giving you like multi-layered questions.
Good. No, there's a lot of good pieces here, but I think that's an important question. So I want to go back to that one first. So the question about, and now my mind went blank. What was the question? The question was
the just reaching out to job boards
yes.
regardless of the years.
Thank you. Yeah. So that question, I think that's a huge one where it's a big one where personally, I'm against the mentality of playing the numbers game when it comes to jobs. I don't think that's going to help anyone because unfortunately, I do think hiring managers and those looking at the applications see right through it. But I think in terms of the piece you were talking about the numbers, like the experience years, I do think is like, to some extent, take it with a grain of salt. If you're 1 year in and you're trying to apply for a principal role, come on, you can, move on. You're not getting that job. But,
Courage.
but still, take a leap of faith, but not that far. But, if you have 1 to 2 years and now or even if you're starting out, let's say, I feel like that's the better spot. A couple months in, not even a year in, and you want a junior role. Yeah, the market's changed a lot. The market is now saying you have to have 3 years for a junior role, which ridiculous. Let's just put it that way. But in that case, 100%. Apply anyways, see what happens. That's why I liked my story before with one of my jobs where it said 3 years and I had one and I got the role. I do think, to your point, it is a part of weeding people out. I do think that's part of it. I also think a big piece of it is lack of education. I don't want to say education, but lack of understanding. Because I think that a lot of times, ultimately, whether it's UX, whether it's design, whether it's any industry, I think we're kind of primed to think, okay, years of experience means like level of abilities. Years of experience means you're better, which is not the case at all. And I think I'm actually a really good example of this, where I was working a couple roles early on, like at the same time, whether it was like multiple contracts at once or a contract and agency or whatever it was. Just doing multiple things that on paper, I had about 1 to 2 years, even 3 years, let's say. But ultimately, I had worked the equivalent of probably way more than that because I was seeing the insides and doing a lot more at once. Not saying you should do that, it's kind of nutty, but I think it's an example of the fact that years means nothing. It should be more about skill levels and what you can bring to the table than about how long you've been doing it. So, in my roundabout way of saying it is 100% just apply. You never know. It's about being more realistic in the sense of how high up of a level you're trying to apply for.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't have said it better. And thanks for calling that out. Take it with a grain of salt. If you're starting out, you're just fresh out of a boot camp or fresh out of college, maybe don't apply for a principal role, right? There's a lot that does go into, the evolution of a career. And as you grow, you do understand why those levels are in place because a principal designer is not going to be thinking in any way, shape, or form the same way as an entry level designer.
And obviously that's an extreme case,
Yeah.
and that was intentional in this case, but exactly like, you're supposed to grow as you learn, like, or learn as you grow. I don't know what that should say, but you're supposed to, as you go up in the levels, you're supposed to continue growing. And like, it's important not to jump that much, I think. But yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that too often people go the opposite two extremes. I think they either are like, well, I don't have it, so I'm not applying and I'm just kind of stuck. Or they're like, kind of screw this and I'm just going to jump. And I don't think either of those are going to be successful personally.
Yeah. Yeah. Always it all goes back to take that first step and see where it takes you. But also don't be too overzealous. Don't start sprinting before you understand the path. But that reminds me, going back to that other question, a lot of the times when people start in the field, they start job hunting, they don't actually realize that there are these two completely different worlds of how people approach design. And there's the corporate world, there's the agency world. I think you yourself went into the agency side, and that might be great for some people, but for other people it might not be the right path. What are your thoughts on how they differ and how people should prepare themselves for those two landscapes?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think that there's not enough clarity out there about the differences. I did have a little bit in the agency side, although it was a contract, really short period of time kind of role. So I don't know if I got, a true perspective of what agency life is like because I wasn't actually working on it was like a part-time role, not even. I'm not even full-time. So it was a couple hours here and there and that was it. But I think the biggest difference really is, I guess, at least with like agency to corporate or agency to startup. In this case, I'm going to categorize startup and corporate together. Just hear me out because I feel like this is a ridiculous piece to say.
Let's
That
hear
I'm
it.
combining the two, but it will make sense. In this case, I think the biggest difference between those two categories is the fact of with agency, you're usually working with multiple clients. You're usually hopping around doing, depending on the agency, they could either be clients related to one individual space or they could be clients that are completely different. But it's the mentality of kind of constantly hopping and switching your mind between projects, is what I've noticed. Whereas more so with like startup or corporate, you're usually working more so for one product, regardless if you're contract, in house, whatever it looks like. But you're normally working more so with one project for a larger period of time. You might switch eventually, but you're normally not doing two or three at once. And I think for me, at least from what I've noticed, that was one of the biggest differences, was just kind of figuring out like the switching hats kind of piece. Um, and then I do think generally though, I don't know if I can really say it's per type of company, but I also think generally like regardless, every company is different. You know, I've worked at so many different companies doing UX at this point, and every single one is different. They all run their teams quite differently. The mentalities are always so different. So I just think that that's more of the kicker almost than necessarily like corporate versus agency versus this or that. But that's just me. I don't know. Like I said, it was a short example of kind of my time in agency world. I'm curious to
Yeah.
your 2 cents here.
No. I mean, that all makes sense. I mean, of course, there's layers to it because the way that not just agency where you're having to balance multiple hats, it is kind of similar to what a startup might be like, where you're not necessarily, juggling. Well, in a way, you are juggling multiple projects because there's a lot of figuring things out on the fly. You're constantly evolving, and it's very fast paced. Whereas, bigger organizations are typically more focused on feature enhancement, which is something important to think about, I think, when you're designing portfolios, right? Depending on the type of designer that you are, you want to reflect whether you're really good at, and this is my opinion, I'd love to hear yours. You're really good at either coming up with these new ideas on how you can improve the overall product, or seeing opportunity in the current existing features and how those can be refined. So there's these two camps that I've typically always looked at. How can designers position themselves when they're creating their portfolios?
Again, a loaded question.
I'm just back to back to back. You know the show Hot Ones?
No.
I hope I don't get flagged for saying them, but essentially it's an interview show where you're interviewing people, but you're eating progressively spicier wings.
Okay, this sounds painful. But yeah,
It's not.
I get the connection now. But no, it is a good question. But yeah, for sure. But jokingly, it was like, okay, how do I answer this now? But in terms of the portfolio, and the reason I'm like this is kind of a hard one to answer is because I know that especially when you're just starting out, it is not easy to put projects on your portfolio, especially real world projects, ones that specifically are related to people from like a business or, that actually has a client associated with it. And so that's where I'm like, okay, this might get me in trouble. But I think if you can really try to make your portfolio as widespread as possible, I think that's the best. And what I mean by this is trying to find some projects that maybe one is about starting a project from scratch, coming up with the idea, ideating, doing all of kind of the front side of it. And then another project, let's say the next one could be more about an existing business, as friends, as family, things like that, and see how you can update and fix their website, their app, whatever it is, and go in and update a feature or something like that. But I think that honestly, like being a little bit of a generalist, especially, or being a generalist more so, as you start out, I think, in my opinion, is the biggest thing you can do. I know that people have pushback on that, but in my opinion, I think being a generalist is one of the best things because it'll, at least at the beginning, because it allows you to really understand a lot of the different pieces and test your abilities and understand what you're good at, and kind of see it all and practice it all so that when you get to later on, you can niche out if you want, if that's even a word. But I think getting back to your question about kind of the two sides of it, yeah, I think you're always going to find that. I think what's interesting though to think about though is like, I think you're always going to get both sides of it though, like at a company. It's just going to depend on the project you're on. Like you may join a company where the first project you work on is at the early phases. So you're going to maybe be more in the room of like the ideating, the iterating phase. I guess iterating would be at both, but the
Mhm.
more so the ideating. And then maybe the next project you work on potentially could be one that's more you've brought in to be in extra hands and it's later on, and you have to help think about like a feature that's already halfway through. That I think being able to do a bit of both and showcase both, I think is honestly really helpful.
100%. And I think you made a really good point, especially in today's marketplace, where being a generalist is kind of now a superpower with the help of tools like, ChatGPT or, Google's Gemini. You are able to expedite or just like supercharge, that's the word I'm looking for, the way you tackle projects, and having an understanding of all of these different levers that might be part of a product team really does help you stand out now.
I would completely agree with that. That I think that it's an interesting switch because when I was first breaking in, so this was, let's say, like almost 5+ years ago now, I remember like I was pushing to be a generalist and I was saying that it was really important to me. And I remember getting a lot of feedback being like, don't do this. Like, figure out your niche, figure out where you want to be, and kind of, carve that out for yourself and quickly switch. Spend 1 year being a generalist and then after that, move on. And I was always like, I don't agree with this mentality. Where now it's interesting to see because to your point, it's flip flop and it's more of what I've been saying. Not saying I'm right, but just saying that more people are saying be a generalist, and kind of focus more and hone in on that. So I think it's interesting. It just shows that like the industry is still changing and it's always going to change. It's just a matter of like learning how to adapt and like remain kind of like to what's important to you, I guess, in a weird way.
100%. And actually, that reminds me, Frankie, early on, one of the pillars, or even today, one of the pillars that you held really closely or talked about was the health space,
Mm, mhm.
right? It's such an interesting facet of, life. You created some blogs about it. You tied it to, the way that people should, consider it within their careers. How do you interact with, the health lifestyle now to kind of keep you going?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a huge, I don't even know what to call it anymore, fitness person. I'm always doing something. I am a huge boxer, spinner, skier, hence the sweater. But no, I'm always doing something. I think for me, part of it is that I was always playing a sport growing up. That was just always who I was. And it's kind of that adult version in my head of it. But I think it's also the clarity that I would get. Like I get. I feel like people like talk about, oh, like the shower is my thinking space. For me, it's a workout. I'm just going down to the gym, like doing like a strength, like weights workout and just having music on just kind of clears my head and gets me away. Even like a spin class, whatever it is. That I think it's huge just to like move a little bit. For a while, I was trying to like in the morning do yoga or do like a core class just to get my body moving, which I need to get back into. But no, I think it's a huge piece. And I think that especially with kind of where we're at today with the high levels of burnout, I think this physical, and I'm going to call it like fitness, physical aspect, like, and there's a lot of categories for this, I think are so important. I think that it's a great way, as I mentioned, to like clear your head, just to get you moving, but to get you away from the screen. I think that there is too many ways to get caught up in different things and just kind of get the scrolling and things like that. You can just get stuck in it for hours and honestly not even know. That I think
Oh, yeah.
just kind of removing yourself and making sure that you take the time for yourself is a huge piece. And this is coming from someone who has been burnt out too many times to count. And it's just because of the mentality of like always having ideas I want to run with that it's, that's part of the focus is the fitness because I'm like, okay, I need to take time for myself. I need to walk away. I need to do this and get, keep my mind creative. Because if you're just constantly going, you're never going to give your brain a break.
Yeah.
Just like I saw, I'm going to butcher it completely, but I saw this once where someone was talking about like the idea of like physically needing to sleep and like recharge our bodies. It's the same with creativity. If we don't let our brains like sleep and like walk away and like take a break, it's not going to keep being creative. Like it needs that recharge. And I think we kind of forget that a lot of times.
Yeah. Lots to take away there. I think you made so many great points. And, I couldn't agree more. Burnout is not something that's uncommon. I think we've all been there. And, what really resonated with me was, your focus on, taking a step back. Don't not forgetting about, health, get a workout in. For me, my favorite thing is when I'm feeling overstressed at work, take a walk.
Yeah.
If I'm blocked on a design problem, that's probably the best activity that I can do to just clear my head and just like
Mhm.
start thinking about like these new ideas when I come back.
Don't
A lot
force
of
it.
people,
I think
what was
that's
that?
the
Yeah,
thing.
don't force
Don't
it.
force it.
Yeah. And I think there's something else that comes with it, right? Because when you're looking at a screen, you're looking at the same content for hours on end. You do get those blinders.
Mhm.
And, it all goes back to taking a break and, you know, coming back to it when you feel a little bit more refreshed.
100%. Yeah, taking that break is a game changer. I do it all the time. If I'm trying to do something, I'm like, okay, you know what? This isn't feeling right. This isn't making sense. I'm not getting where I want to be. Just continuing to do it isn't going to get you anywhere. You're just going to get more frustrated and go even more in the opposite direction you want to be. So, I think, especially like kind of tying it back also like with the job search a little bit here, I think this is a huge piece that we all can get, whether senior, junior, whatever it is, like we can all get caught up in that job search being like, this is the thing I have to focus on. This isn't, a necessity almost. I understand the importance of it, trust me, but I think that you still have to take those breaks. That again, like if you kind of put all this pressure on it and you force yourself and say, okay, this needs to happen right now, this, and this, like you won't get anywhere. No offense. It just, you're going to get in a bad rabbit hole and it's not worth it. Like you said, go for a walk, go do a 10-minute workout. It doesn't need to be much, but just, shut the computer, walk away and come back refreshed. Like it's honestly been huge for me. I do it all the time whenever I need it.
And you know what? That reminds me, a common technique that a lot of people do when they're sending out resumes is to just drill down on every single job listing. And for some people that works, for others they feel differently. I personally think that that's not the greatest thing to do. What do you think about that? Do you have any advice?
I agree with you. Yeah. I don't think that it's gonna work for 2 reasons. One, it goes back to the numbers game, which isn't productive at all. And 2, exactly, you're just gonna submit to submit, and just kinda get down that rabbit hole of, like, not even paying attention to some extent. Like, you just go on autopilot a little bit. And again, I understand it. It's a lot easier said than done to be like, don't stress about it. We all stress about it. And that's not what I'm saying. It's just more of, exactly like take a step away, kind of, take a moment to yourself or take a moment to do something else. But I think some of the advice there is, excuse me, is to think about really focusing on what you want and what you're interested in. I think that makes it easier where I like to say is like, look for 2 to 3 industries or spaces you're interested in. And I'm not talking like UX versus this or that. I'm talking about what you want to do UX in, you know, tech, fintech, ed tech, fitness, et cetera, et cetera. The areas go on and on. But I would say it's like pick 2 or 3 of those categories that you're interested in and then apply based on those roles or based on those groupings. That way you're being strategic and it's not just feeling like I don't know what to apply to. I'm stuck. It's this black hole, or black hole, I guess. But, if you give yourself a little structure without pigeonholing, I actually think it goes a long way because that way you're still being like, okay, I still have plenty of roles to apply to. But it's not just a free for all, okay, click, click, click. It's a let me focus. Does this actually matter to me? Is this, related to an interest of mine or do I like one of the projects they're working on? Doesn't always work. Nothing is perfect, but I think it gets you in that better mindset that you're not just this, autopilot hoping that everything's going to work mentality.
100%. I think, and this is my personal opinion, but I think when I see posts where, and this does happen regardless of the approach you take, but people will reach out to like 300 applications, they don't hear anything. A lot of the times it's because they don't have the right strategy. And I think you laid out a very, very beautiful strategy of saying, hey, you know what? Let's take a step back. What are my interests and how can I best position myself for these types of roles within the design world? And Frankie, I have to ask, what made you make that change into sharing content about helping designers break into the field? Was there an aha moment for you, or did it just kind of sporadically happen?
I wish I could take the credit. I was working on a project at that time. One of the people I was working with kind of said to me, he was like, look, if I can give you a piece of advice, He's like, I don't really care how you do it. Pick a medium and run with it, but you need to get your opinions out there. And I was like, okay, at this point, I was in that mindset of, I don't know what I'm doing. I want to get a job and I'm not sure what to be doing. And so I was like, okay, I'll try it. Not my thing, but I'll go for it type mentality. I was like, I got nothing to lose. And ultimately ended up starting to write on Medium, which I think is what you were talking about before about some of the fitness ones. That was when I was kind of poking around at some products that I was using all the time. And ones that I like started to think about the experience of and was like, actually, like, here's my take on this, which they were fun to do. And it was something that I felt I had the authority to be writing about. Because I think a lot of times that's the biggest thing is like understanding what you're comfortable writing online. And it's not a comfortability about what you're comfortable sharing about like you personally. It's more about, well, I'm new. I can't go writing about the top 5 things to know as a UX designer because I don't know them. And so I started small, being like, okay, let me just share what I know and figure out ways that I can just start like practicing what I'm learning was ultimately what it was. It was kind of a shift of let me help my own self almost in a weird way. And ultimately realize that like people wanted to hear this, that there were people kind of starting behind me in a sense of like starting this career after me. And they just started reaching out. And I was like, okay, like this is something that is actually making an impact. And just kind of stuck with it and now have obviously maneuvered what I write about a little bit. It's no longer, the projects I'm working on because of NDAs and stuff, but more about like my learnings and what I wish I knew, focusing on different aspects of it and like sharing tips in different ways. And honestly, I love it. Funny, one of those things I didn't think I would, and I love it. I spend too much time doing it, and it's okay. It's
It
helped me
it
too much.
it's addictive, right? I mean, my experience, it has not, it just started, but once you start getting those messages of, people thanking you and you're seeing the value that it's providing, it does become like this dopamine effect. Like, oh, wow, it's kind of like volunteering.
Mhm.
You just feel good about it.
It's
Do you have any big plans for, your content?
I'd also say though, for before I answer that one question, sorry, I have one last note to add to the other question.
Yeah, go for it.
I'd also add to that last piece, it's not only just making you feel good and, finding that you can make an effect on other people. There's also the personal side of it too, where you grow a lot as an individual. That I think that by posting online, by sharing your opinions, whether it's in your own posts, your own kind of pieces, or even just like on comments responding to other people, if they're thoughtful and not just, oh, I love this, but like, here's my take on it, it actually gets you to practice what you possibly would talk about in an interview or how you would share out some of your designs. And so, yeah, it's the dopamine, but it's also the practicing and the skills that you're building as well for yourself. So just wanted to call that out that there's a lot of benefit to it if anyone's considering to do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, the fun stuff. The big fun question about what I'm working on. I actually have a lot of I have a big news. I have some big news I should share. I
I
actually
have been thinking, sorry to cut you off, but I've been thinking about it since you told me. I was like, what could it possibly be?
So yes, I have officially released my first ebook that I've written. It's now online ready for purchase, which is super exciting. It's one of the things I've been talking a lot about, specifically about building portfolios and helping you to create a more of a narrative and a better storyline that's going to be more engaging and more true to the actual case study story rather than like the play-by-play story. So highly recommend it. I'm obviously biased, but I generally created this. It's a method called the UX portfolio sandwich method. It is a mouthful, but it's a great title, in my opinion, because it connects it all together. Where it's a 3-step process that helps you think about the differences between the play by play and the case study story, and to think about which deliverables should be there and how to add them to the case study so that anyone who's scanning actually gets an idea of the whole story rather than having to read through paragraphs of paragraphs, which they won't. And so it's a better way to help you with specifically to hiring managers because those are the ones who don't have the time. So that is now on it's frankly ux.com. So that is the exciting news that I can't wait for all of you to see.
That is so exciting. Huge congrats. There's
Thank you.
so much work that goes behind the scenes for ebooks or any workshop content. So I'm really happy to hear that you put that work in, and I'm really excited to see it. You're definitely going to see me dropping into that link For those watching, that's going to be in the show notes. So don't forget to check that out. I'm curious, with this ebook, are you planning to do any supplemental workshops? Is that something that might be in the works, or am I sparking ideas?
You are sparking ideas. I have done workshops on this book concept before. I've actually done it a number of times. I did it at a couple, like a conference. I've done it at a few places. So you're sparking some ideas. There's just definitely not enough hours in the day. That's my biggest problem.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll see, but you can look out for maybe some workshops related to that. What I might do is I'll take a poll on LinkedIn once I release it there to get a better idea of if that's something people want to see. But if it is,
And
let me know.
remind me again, did it drop already, or is it releasing soon?
It is out there. I just haven't posted yet.
Okay. Well, by the time this drops, it might be already out there. So
Oh, it
look
will
out
be.
for it, guys. It
It'll
will
be
be.
out there. Yeah, it's coming out next week.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Frankie, it's been great chatting with you. You are such a great person to speak to. The way that you explain things and all of the advice that you gave throughout this conversation, it's been very thought provoking. So, thanks so much for joining me here today.
Of course. Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun. As you can tell, I love talking about this whole space. So anytime, I'm happy to do it.
It's a great space. I can't recommend it enough for people that are considering UX, UI. It's a learning experience. Don't be afraid by the constant news. Markets always go up and down. It's just a matter of, seeing what you like and giving it a shot. I think that's the theme for today. Don't be afraid to take the first step.
I would agree. We keep coming back to that. Full circle.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, well, thanks again. I'll catch you next time.
Sounds good. Thanks.